Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're very happy to be here this afternoon. It's our pleasure to present this interesting topic to you. I'm confident that you'll find lots of valuable information and stimulating questions to think about as we proceed through the program. My name is Mark Thurber. I'm a partner at Andrews Kurth, based in our Houston and Dubai offices. And we have three panelists in addition with us who I'll introduce in a moment. Our panelists are all here by compliments of the European wind industry. Although that is not the topic of our panel, we're talking about turning country pledges on wind power into investment opportunities throughout the world. But it is appropriate that we have the European wind industry here because they're the biggest and best in the world at what they do. They've been doing it for the longest, and they've been doing it in the most places. The growth in wind is anticipated to be driven going forward by improved efficiencies in the land-based turbines, significant cost reduction in offshore development, and reaping the benefits of the Paris 2015 Accord through renewed global expansion. We've discussed a number of these topics together as a panel already a couple of times, and I think you'll be interested in the views of our excellent participants here. They're well-informed and engaging, and I'll take a minute to introduce them now. And then I will give them an opportunity to give us a brief introductory statement, and we'll proceed with the discussion from there. Rainer Karan has graduated in mechatronics, which is a discipline that combines applications for mechanical and electrical engineering. He's been working with WFES in Italy since 2006 as a general manager. This is, of course, the Italian branch of the larger WFES wind system companies. Its core business comprises the development, manufacture, sales, and maintenance of wind technology. Since then, he's taken an increased lead in the development of WFES clientele and in developing new markets in Middle East and North Africa. And he responds directly to the president of the Mediterranean region. Halfdan Brustad is with Statoil. He's a vice president of renewable energy wind projects. He's been working since 1984 in the shipping, oil and gas, and aluminum industries, with various project management and business development responsibilities. In 2007, he was appointed as Senior Vice President for Projects and Procurement in Statoil. And in 2011, was appointed as Vice President for Offshore Wind Asset Management and Renewable Energy within Statoil. And finally, Giles Dixon is the Chief Executive Officer of the European Wind Energy Association. He served as Vice President of Global Public Affairs at Alstom before joining EWEA. He was previously a UK government civil servant for over 15 years. He has substantial experience and knowledge of European climate policies, having led negotiations on the environment at the UK Permanent Representation in Brussels, and having overseen as well Alstom's engagement on these issues with governments worldwide. We'll now hear a brief opening statement from Rainer, and then from Halfdan, followed by Giles. Go ahead, yes.
Okay, I should start?
Yes, please, thank you.
I think we said you start. Okay, now, welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here at the World Global Energy Summit. We're speaking about future energy pledge, future energy renewable installations, and especially of wind, in my case. I have already good news that we're not speaking only about the future, because the reality is that it has already started and it's more than ongoing. And this is not only globally, where we would expect that renewable and wind has already started heavily over the last decade, I would say, but also in the Middle East and MENA region, wind and renewable plays already its role. It's always good to give some living examples, I would say, So I just want to mention, for example, the Jordan wind farm, the Dafila wind farm, 170 megawatt, last year came on grid. Also in Africa, Lake Turkana, 300 megawatt in Kenya has been started. And we can continue with examples in Egypt and Morocco. So we are not speaking anymore about something on the paper, future. We are speaking something which is reality. And I'm sure that wind will not play only a global role, will also play a significant role in the energy mix in MENA region and Middle East. This shows, in my opinion, that or confirms that wind energy is already a technology which is deployed, which is with an industry, strong growing industry, proven technology. It has shown to be a competitive energy source, reliable. We can bring it fast on the grid. All this assures me that also in new markets emerging, and especially here, we are speaking here, we are in the Middle East, it will play its role also in the future. I would also to underline this future pledge to shift the change, to shift to renewable and wind energy is not happening only on country level, it's also on corporate level. We see the changes taking place. Companies, corporates, which are not typical utilities or IPP, are investing, developing and investing in renewable wind. We have all heard the announcement of Google, IKEA. They do it because it creates an economic value for them, maybe also as a marketing, but also to shift to a sustainable solution. The change is happening also, I think, on the end consumers. The end consumers are willing and are pushing for sustainable, renewable solutions. Several researchers have shown that they are also ready to pay for it. So altogether, we are speaking of something which is happening now, and we have to put it now again under the right legal framework in the individual country to fulfill the pledge for the future. If we put it under the right framework in the country, I'm sure that renewable and wind is a major contributor to the future. Thank you.
Halvdan, would you proceed?
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Mark. I'm Halvdan Brustad from Statoil. And, well, this is a difficult topic to talk about, but I will point on some few factors that I feel is important. And first of all, this turning country pledges on wind power into investment projections is about will, prioritizing, and affordability. It's incredible what a country can do, and for that sake, a company to put effort and strong will into the equation. The policymakers need to shift their mindset and also establish a policy framework that fosters increase of renewable and low carbon footprint to meet the 2-degree targets. Secondly, is about the financing capacity. Is there enough capital in the market to cater for a huge deployment of wind projects? And in many areas, offshore wind will be the option for large-scale developments. Offshore wind is seen as an immature industry in the financing sector today, which adds huge risk premiums and complexity into the projects. That doesn't help the economy. In addition, many financing players prefer to enter in after construction. This needs to change. Thirdly, it's the world's willingness to lift the price of carbon, namely the carbon tax on emissions. As an example, Europe may need to increase their carbon tax 10 times compared to today. Is the world countries willing to do this? So far, they have not been willing to do this. But we need to look into that direction as well. And lastly is the industry response to the reduction of cost for wind power. As Rainer said, the onshore wind is already competitive in many regions, but this, of course, is dependent on deployment. If the deployment long term, is there an industry that will dare to invest in innovation, industrialization, and standardization, which is needed to bring the cost down? As an example, offshore wind has reduced their cost more than original projections so far, but will need a step change to take further huge steps. Our predictions is by early 20s, offshore wind will be competitive to other energy sources, but deployment is crucial here. And in our portfolio in Statoil, we are primarily an oil and gas company. We have 2 major wind projects, and we also are the first one to have the world first floating test farm for offshore wind. And on Dutchen, we have Masta together us, who is one of the companies here sponsoring this. If those 4 elements that I have mentioned is in place, the country's pledge can be fulfilled. Hydropower, solar, wind, and energy efficiency will be the dominant players to reach the green target set.
Thank you. Thank you. Giles, would you like to speak to us for a moment?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Just a few facts and figures about wind to begin with. First of all, wind is now part of the mainstream of the global electricity supply. It is 3% of the world's electricity that is consumed today. In the US, it's 5%. In Europe, we've now reached 10% of all of our electricity comes from wind. And the sector is expanding rapidly. Last year, we saw a record figure of 64 gigawatts of new wind farms installed worldwide. Just to put that figure in perspective, 64 gigawatts is more than the total power generation capacity of Spain and Portugal combined. The IEA has then said that going forward to 2040, the world will need to invest collectively $160 billion every year in new wind. Again, let's put that figure in perspective. $160 billion is equivalent to the combined GDP of Morocco, Jordan, and Lebanon. So that amount needs to be invested in wind every year from now until 2040. Then let's talk about costs. As colleagues have already said, wind, onshore wind, the costs have fallen significantly in recent years. If you want to build a new power plant today, onshore wind is going to be your cheapest option. In terms of the levelized costs of electricity, onshore wind in most regions of the world today is now the cheapest form of new power generation capacity, cheaper than coal, gas, solar, or nuclear. Then the capacity factors are increasing all of the time. There was a time when people used to say, yeah, your wind farms are nice, but they're only generating electricity 20% of the time. Well, now average global capacity factors for onshore wind are around 30%, 40% for offshore wind. In this particular region, we're already seeing capacity factors in excess of 50%, where the wind conditions are particularly strong. And then, of course, wind farms tend to be fairly large scale. They're usually connected to the grid. They're providing a reliable form of electricity. I just wanted to share those general observations about wind with you. Now, we're here today to talk about the pledges that countries, especially developing and emerging economies, have made for the Paris Climate Summit on wind and how we turn those pledges into investments. Let's look at those pledges. Pledges, of course, were submitted in the famous INDCs, the country climate action plans that 160 countries submitted to the Paris Summit. Out of those 160 plans, 70 highlighted wind as a key mitigation technology. Many of those 70 countries had specific gigawatt or megawatt targets for wind. China said we will have 200 gigawatts of wind by 2020. India said we will have 60 gigawatts of wind by 2022. Tunisia said 1.8 gigawatts by 2030. And then smaller, poorer countries such as Bangladesh even had a number, 400 megawatts by 2030. Mongolia, 350 megawatts by 2030. Then other countries had not gigawatt or megawatt targets, they had percentage targets. So, for example, Morocco said 14% of our total power generation capacity by 2020 will be wind. Brazil said that by 2030, between 28 and 33% of our total energy mix will be non-hydro renewables, with wind being the biggest share of that. And even countries such as Namibia had ambitious targets. Namibia said 70% of our total power generation capacity by 2030 will be renewables. So there's some really ambitious commitments there for wind in the pledges that developing countries and emerging economies put before the Paris Climate Summit. Now, how do we translate those pledges into investments? I'm going to say two things. First, the things that the emerging economies themselves need to do. And second, the things that the rest of us, the industry and the industrialized economies, need to do. First of all, what do the emerging economies need to do? First thing they need to do is to ensure that there is a strong climate for foreign investment and for doing business. And this means very simple things like having robust contract law in place, having a non-discriminatory business climate with non-discriminatory rules on ownership, for example. It means ensuring that the financial services sector is working smoothly so that suppliers can get paid, so that those doing the operation and maintenance of wind farms can get paid. It means also, ideally, having dollar convertibility, okay? The second thing that emerging economies need to do is have stable and predictable policy and regulatory frameworks in place that will support investments in wind. Morocco has this already. They've already got 1 gigawatt of wind. They'll have another gigawatt of wind by 2020. Investors in the industry look at the policy and regulatory framework, and they like what they see. It's clear, visible, and long-term. Egypt is in the process of developing that long-term policy framework. They had one set of policies to begin with for the first investments. They're now evolving. A country like Iran, which has huge wind potential, the Iranian government is talking of 6 gigawatts in the near term. That country doesn't yet have a policy framework, but it's early days, but they will need to develop that policy framework to bring in the investments. And the third and final thing the emerging economies need is absorption capacity. This is really an issue for the poorest countries, but it's things like having the right physical infrastructure, the ports, the roads, so you can actually take the blades and the nacelles to the place where the wind farm is going to be developed. It means having the supply chain in place. It means having the skills base locally so that once you've built the wind farm, people are there to do the operation and maintenance. And crucially, of course, for wind, it means having the grid infrastructure in place so that the wind farm, the electricity it's generating can be connected to the centers of demand. And then we have the things that the rest of us need to be doing. By the rest of us, I mean the industry and industrialized economies. The industry, of course, needs to keep reducing costs. We've made major progress in recent years. We've cut the costs for onshore wind by 30% globally in the last 5 years. We can and will go much further to ensure that wind remains affordable. And then in the finance sector, there's a whole load of things that need to happen. This is not about finding the capital. The capital is available. It's about making sure that the financial instruments are also available so that the risk that is entailed in wind investments is kept to a minimum. What do I mean here? Well, there's something that the private financial institutions have to do, and there's a role also for the public sector and the public financial institutions. Crucially, it's about sharing risk between the public and the private sector. And here, multilateral development banks have a role to play. Rich country export credit agencies have a role to play. Let me give you some examples. Loan guarantees can be extremely useful. Some of our members built a 120 megawatt wind farm in Ethiopia recently, Ashigoda, it is called. That was only made possible because there was an export credit guarantee from the French Export Credit Agency, and there was a loan guarantee from the French Development Agency, which then encouraged the private banks to come to the party and put their private capital on the table for that project because they saw there was a publicly backed loan guarantee. The other thing you can do is use what are known as first loss instruments. This is where you have a consortium of lenders involved in a project, and the deal is that the private banks and financial institutions get paid back first, and the public financial institutions get paid back last. Some people call that structured debt or mezzanine debt. And the final thing we can do to share risk around wind investments in the poorest countries is to underwrite, in some cases, the power purchase agreements. There have been many instances of wind projects having been developed in very poor countries. The government has offered a PPA as the long-term financial underpinning for that project, and the Western private banks have said, well, actually, we don't trust that government's PPA. We don't think it's worth the paper it is written on. Now, there are some bodies out there that are beginning to offer underwriting of such PPAs. So in the World Bank group, MEGA are already offering this. In the US government, OPIC are offering this. We as the European industry are saying to governments in Europe that they should use some of their overseas development money to put it into trust funds that can be used when necessary to underwrite these PPAs. So as you can see, there's a range of things that industrialized countries can be doing to reduce the risk around wind investments in the poorest countries. So that is it. There are key things that need to happen in the emerging economies themselves in terms of the policy and business framework and absorption capacity. And then there are things that we, the industry, and financial institutions need to be doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Those are some excellent points. Rainer, we've already touched a little bit on costs. And of course, wind and solar in many places are being developed as side by side. I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about how you see wind costs coming down and where wind projects fit versus solar projects. What is your experience in this region?
Yeah, as a general representative of wind, I think wind has certain advantages. It's very competitive, but I would not play it as a game wind against PV or vice versa. I think it's both are needed to fulfill our future ambition, to be clear. For sure, why I say this, apart from different competitive levels, maybe between wind and PV, but I think they fit also together because from a physicality in some countries, in some places, PV is mainly the peak or is the peak during the noontime. Wind maybe can cover certain peaks in the morning and in the evening time. So I think there's not really a conflict. Concerning wind and generally, because I want to point out that in some countries, or especially in the Middle East, we still have to say that they have a good wind potential. Because everybody thinks clearly about PV, about in North Africa, in the MENA region, and in Middle East. But nobody knows how excellent wind resources some of these countries have. Even to have a neighbor country here, Saudi Arabia. I think nobody thinks so much about wind in Saudi Arabia until few months, years ago, everybody thought Saudi Arabia, apart from petrol, obviously oil, there's only sun which could play an important role in the future. With a lot of work done, I think recently by different entities, it has shown that, for example, Saudi Arabia has a huge wind regime and can play, and I would say, and better than most of the countries. So it's not in this. It's not a question if we can do wind. In, for example, Saudi Arabia, you just have to say how much gigawatt. You can make 50 gigawatt without any problem with excellent wind regime and a competitive business. Like we have seen, it's difficult to say on the paper wind is so competitive. We just have to look on the recent outcome of certain tenders. Look at Egypt, what happened in the last PO tender, 4 cents per kilowatt hour has shown clearly that wind is competitive. I think everybody who knows the sector knows what happened in the 850 megawatt in Morocco, which even went lower. So I think this is a typical sign that wind is competitive because it's proven now really with practical facts and not only with theoretical numbers.
Thanks. If I could ask you a follow-up question. Do you see wind and solar working together to reduce the amount of baseload fossil fuel capacity that needs to be installed? Are there certain countries that have a high enough geographical diversity that, in effect, they contribute to some of the baseload demand?
Yeah, again, coming back to practical examples, because I like it to Egypt has more than 50% capacity factor. So I would say also even Saudi Arabia has a lot of places, and we speak tens of gigawatt, maybe 100 gigawatt, places of more than around 50% capacity factor. So if you consider this plus certain characteristic, maybe because the energy we don't need maybe in certain periods, we need them maybe in summer, especially in the Middle East. Nowadays, even half of the installed capacity is not needed in winter times because most of them is used in summertime. So we find also places in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, but also in other places in the Middle East, where the concentration is, for example, in summer times, the main production is in summer times. I think all this together can tailor-made and can engineer a very nice solution, which wind and in some circumstances, maybe PV, I'm not the expert in PV, but can bring together.
Very good, thank you. Halfdan, you work for a major oil company, a state-owned one. It's clear these days that the oil companies are looking with much more determination at renewables development. Without discussing any confidential details, would you mind talking to us about how investment decisions are reached within oil companies as to the competing demands on the capital, especially between traditional exploration projects versus developing a wind farm, for example?
Yes. First, I would also say that the oil and gas companies also need to look into the future, what will happen beyond 2030, and we have this renewable target. Then we have long-term investments, and therefore Statoil and others need now to position themselves for a new energy market. And then you need to establish a strategy. And if you shall get something in an oil and gas company, for instance, like we have done, we have started with offshore wind, and we will embark on other like solar and energy systems and so forth. Then you must have also have a strategy that allows that, because every investment decision is linked to the strategy. So then you asked, how can a renewable offshore wind project compete with an oil and gas project? Then you have the boundaries there. If you look into exploration, it's a huge risk profile, and it's high return, but it can also be the other way. And if you also look at the income side of an oil and gas field, is you have the first year with peak production with very high income, and then it will drop down. If you looked into an offshore wind, there you will have a stable production for years. So it's a complete different risk profile, and it's much more slimmer. And then you look at the return of capital. And what we see is that offshore wind compete well with heavy oil projects and also, for that sake, oil sand projects. But for, like we have some elephants reservoirs, which is huge, we cannot compete. But we compete well with the heavy oil and so forth. But also, what we also has done, we have established a new business area, and we will establish a different business model to put effort and capital injection into that area to focus on renewable. But competition-wise, we see that especially for offshore wind, that is seen as very costly at the moment, but the price is going down. It competes well within the strategy and also on economics. And we also see that to have a combination of the different cash profiles is beneficial for the company.
And a follow-up question, do you see the analysis that takes place within your company as being similar or maybe quite different to how it's approached within an IOC?
Well, I think in an IOC you will have the same issues on the board of directors because we have cooperation with a lot of them, and we are only 67% state-owned. Mm-hmm. So we are listed on the stock market. Sure. Mm-hmm. So we have to deliver on the targets as well.
You have shareholders.
Yes, we have, and they like to see barrels instead of gigawatts, perhaps. But an IOC needs also to see where shall I position my company for the future, and if you say that it may change in 2030, the work starts now, because it's only 14 years left.
Right.
And the IOCs are looking into, but I see a differentiation between European oil and gas companies and IOCs compared to American at the moment.
Great, thank you. Giles, you touched on some of these points in your opening remarks, but would you care to give us more detail on what type of roadblocks are out there between the pledges that were made in Paris a month ago and actually achieving the results that are being pledged? What are the principal roadblocks that we're going to see?
Yeah, I've already talked about potential roadblocks by way of the investment climate, the business climate in developing and emerging economies, absorption capacity for investments, and roadblocks also in terms of not the availability of capital, but how capital is actually being mobilized, what financial instruments are being used. In particular, are we making enough use of those financial instruments that will reduce risk for everybody involved in an investment? Some of the financial channels that are being used today still entail too much risk for individual investors, and there needs to be greater pooling of risk. I'll say one other point, which is perhaps interesting, if not controversial. The commitments that emerging economies made on wind in their INDCs are impressive, as I have said. Actually, they could become even more impressive. We know that there were some emerging economies that were holding back on their pledges, and they were deliberately holding back in the hope that the rich countries would offer to finance their investments in wind and other renewables, finance or provide other forms of support. Now, I talked earlier about the important role that export credit agencies in rich countries have to play, the important role that multilateral development banks have to play in terms of being lenders of last resort. We would suggest that the more these institutions can come forward and say, we ourselves pledge to provide financial support to wind investments in emerging economies, the more pledges we will see and the higher pledges we will see from the emerging economies themselves. There are deals to be done there at the highest political level.
Thank you, thank you. Rainer, what are the, you've mentioned a couple already. What are you, in the Middle East, what are the countries that are best positioned to have further wind development?
Yeah, as I said, some countries have already put the framework in place and actually are doing wind, like Jordan. Jordan, as I said, the example before, they're doing wind, have put the framework in place and continuing. Then in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has an extreme good regime. I understand the situation there is more difficult. They're a major oil-producing country, so, but also there, I think they are making their minds clear what they want to do in the future. And I think something maybe will happen, I'm quite sure also there in the future, because they cannot ignore that the wind regime and also the competitiveness, as it's shown in other countries now recently, they cannot ignore the renewable and the wind sector, because it's also very interesting for them. If you have 100 gigawatt of potential high wind sites, I think you sooner or later you will benefit out of it. But at the moment, the framework is not clear, but I think they're working on it. Oman has a good wind regime. Also there, still to be worked on the framework to make the first wind farms happening and then kicking up and create an industry, let's say. These, I would say, are the major countries in the Middle East. In the UAE, I see less potential for wind because of the resources, they are limited. Other countries like, okay, we know Yemen, Syria have a very good wind regime, but at the moment have other issues to be solved before.
Sure, yeah.
This is, I think, the overview in the Middle East, I think. Then Egypt, I think, is well known.
Well known, yes. Halfdan, Statoil, you've mentioned in our sessions prior to coming on stage here, some of the countries that you've worked in. It's not just, Europe or other developed countries. You've been in some developing countries. What are your strategies or focus going forward? Do you target certain areas of the world for policy reasons, or do you just go where the best deals are, a combination? How do you decide which areas to operate in?
We are, of course, within the oil and gas exploring around the globe, of course, and looking for good opportunities. And when we enter into a new region or country, it's a certain process that you need to go through them. But what we bring with us is that we also would like to assist in developing the country we do enter into. That is a standard policy in Statoil. So, let's say the renewable business that is newly started, where will we go from there? Of course, when we are outside Europe, we will primarily focus on countries where we already have operations, because we know the policy framework, we know the politicians, we know the government, and that is an easier access. And we are also seeing how can we do our oil and gas business in that particular country more sustainable with regards to a low carbon footprint. And here we will work together with what I represent, the renewable division in Statoil, and the oil and gas division to cater for that. And but we also have this floating offshore wind project in Scotland. That will be the world's first one, as I said earlier. Then we will open up a new space also and enter into market where they have the affordability and the infrastructure to take that at the first time. But having said that, we need to see that there are strong will to invest in infrastructure so we can plug in the electricity and sell to the home sale, the domestic market.
Okay, great. We're running a little short, but I have one final question for both Rainer and Giles. We've mentioned a couple of times the great track record that Europe as a whole has, and Vestas in particular. Going forward, are there lessons learned as you? Obviously, there's lots of wind projects to be built, especially after December 2015. Things that you will do different. What are the lessons learned and possible modes of operation going forward? Rainer, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, it's always good to use the experience from the past. Our company's 30 years in wind, and we're focusing on wind. And as I said, we know that the future is to go out in new markets. For example, we're operating in 70 countries, and in 35 out of the 70s, we have been the first one building a wind farm. So we know how important it is to make it the first time right, because the first wind farm to be built in a country is the most complicated, because you have to not only to master all the difficulties, which is the engineering phase, financing phase, you have also to overcome the opinion, the global opinion. It's not possible, like we know, who do something different than before is confronted with a lot of doubts. But I think our vision must be to bring something new and to make it better. What should I say? It's a multi-step effort. First of all, to bring the idea, and the countries have to clean up their ideas. How would like that they can do? What should like the energy mix of the country? They have to investigate what is their grid capability. Don't underestimate. I think no serious energy plan can be done if there's not an investigation. How is the grid of the country, and how the grid has to be developed in the future to absorb the different energy resources, and renewable in particular. Having this clear where you want to go and what is the starting point, I think a legal framework, long-term stable legal framework, is the key to attract investors, finding financing, putting the project on the ground. I think these are the easy principles which have to be followed. I think these are the basic rules. Then you can achieve it in a different way. As we have seen countries, they're going feed-in tariff, they're going BO tender, they're going IPP. There are different ways to achieve a sustainable growth in renewable and to install it. I think there's no truth, right and wrong on this. I think there are different ways to approach it. We have seen working auction systems. We see a lot in different areas of the world. I think both ways always can work and have some advantages and disadvantages. And the fortune is for new countries now building up in renewables, they have the variety to get experience from the different other places, which was maybe like this 5 years ago. So I think it's important to look how it worked there and find the best solution for the energy mix of the individual country to fulfill the future energy pledge, which a lot of countries fortunately have given the trust in renewable.
Great, thank you. Giles, time's up, but please provide any further thoughts that you have.
Yes, make sure you've got the right electricity grid, and make sure you've got the right type of electricity market, and that together the grid and the market are able to integrate as much variable wind as possible. into the system. I'd add one final point. A lot of people out there all over the world think the reason for doing wind is to reduce CO2 emissions. Yes, wind is zero CO2. It's one reason for doing wind. But the main reason for doing wind is economics. And that's the point that everybody has to make and understand. It's the cheapest form of new power generation capacity. It reduces countries' dependence on fossil fuels, reduces the need for expensive fossil fuel imports and subsidies. It also creates jobs and GDP growth. The wind industry in Europe alone today is over 250,000 jobs, and that number is growing every year. It is a significant contributor to Europe's GDP. It's nearly $100 billion a year to Europe's GDP, and it's around $30 billion of exports to the European economy every year. So when you think wind, think the economic benefits of doing wind.
Thank you to the panel and to all of you for attending. There are many more topics that we could talk about. This is a broad and important and exciting topic. We were happy to have the opportunity to speak to you today and look forward to interacting with you in the future. Thank you again.